lot of misinformation floating around online, and the Verify team is here to get you the facts about what you, the viewers, are questioning. A few weeks ago, we put out a story that verified that more people have died from COVID-19 in 8 months than died in the seasonal flu in 5 years. Some people were critical of those COVID numbers, claiming things like car crash deaths are also counted as COVID deaths to inflate the numbers. We heard your comments and took these claims back to our experts. Let's verify. Are car crash deaths being reported as COVID-19 deaths? Here are sources. Dr. Robert Anderson. He's the chief of the Mortality Statistics Branch for the National Center of Health Statistics at the CDC. We also talked with a spokesperson for the Florida Health Department in Orange County.
It's important to understand that there are really two streams of information on deaths coming in to the CDC with regard to COVID-19.
Dr. Anderson says those two streams are the case surveillance system and death certificates. Case surveillance is the quickest way to get data. Healthcare providers mark whether a patient died from COVID-19 and send that information to the state health department and the CDC. Think of that as preliminary data. Then there's the death certificate. That's submitted to the state after a medical examiner or coroner has determined the official cause of death. And that is the final data.
The death certificates tend to lag the case reports by about 2 weeks. So in some cases, a death may be flagged as a COVID death initially in the case reporting, but when the death certificate comes in, it may show something different.
Something like this happened in Orlando, Florida over the summer. A man who died in a motorcycle accident was initially marked down as a COVID-19 death. Our researchers got information straight from that spokesperson with the Florida Health Department in Orange County. This spokesperson says that the man tested positive for COVID-19 before dying, and COVID-19 was listed as a cause of death. That spokesperson says that after the medical examiner and epidemiologist reviewed the death, they removed it from the COVID fatality list. So we can verify. While COVID-19 could be listed in a case surveillance report, our experts say it would be corrected on the death certificate.